All right, so we have one more talk before lunch. Matthias is going to be talking about iOS malware. Very interesting topic. This is also the first time that Matthias is speaking. We love having new speakers, so let's give him a OBTS round of applause.
For having me. It's a pleasure, of course. So let me shortly tell you something about who I am. So my name is Matthias. I am working at Deutsche Bahn at the mobile security team. So we're basically responsible for the security of every mobile device which is operated by Deutsche Bahn. And shortly ago, I wrote my master's thesis about the detection of iOS malware. So a lot of the things that I'm covering in this talk today are still valid, even though that thesis was handed in 2019. And if you like to connect on Twitter, my link is Healthy Driver without an A. That's some kind of a childhood mistake. Yeah. What I'm going to talk about today is about recent examples of iOS malware. So it's nothing new. Every one of these reports has already been done on a really good technical level. But I'd like to connect the dots and to refer to some of these reports. After that, we're talking a little bit about the difference between jailbreaks and malware, because at least for some companies or some papers, this might be a little bit confusing, and I'd like to shine a little bit of light on that one. And then we will go to detecting jailbreaks and malware, basically what can be done today, and I will share some ideas of what can be done to improve the detection further. So let's start directly. And I was a little bit surprised when I created that slide because I just wanted to add all the CVEs that have been either found by Google in the wild series or even by Apple after 2014. And I was surprised that they fit the slide quite a lot. So it's actually 40 CVEs that have been used for some in the wild exploitation of iOS or macOS devices, but every time iOS has been impacted. And we're starting with the first example of that one already, which is, of course, Pegasus. It was found in 2016. It used 3 CVEs at the time for exploiting the device. It has an infection vector of WebKit. So basically, someone sent you a malicious URL. You click on that URL. The browser got exploited. The first stage is going to be downloaded, and afterwards it starts into exploiting the kernel via an info leak and a kernel memory corruption. At the time, this sample was detected because Citizen Lab got a hold of one sample of the infection URL. They downloaded it onto a device. They saw that something malicious was going on there. Yeah, and then they sent over that sample to Lookout to further investigate, and that's actually a typo on the slide. The detection technical analysis has been done by Citizen Lab and by Lookout. At that time, it was attributed to NSO, and the targets were human rights activists or journalists. And to be fairly clear, it's not NSO who is targeting that people, but of course it's the customers of NSO who are basically targeting that one. And NSO is just selling it. It had some kind of special features, which were like persistency. So if you reboot the device, the malware was still there. It's implemented a framework for messenger hooking, and it used a lot of techniques that we found in jailbreaks at the time of the development. It was only valid until iOS 9, until it was found. Yeah, and that's basically one of the first examples of a malware that we have seen who is being deployed via one click. And some of the, of course, most important part, the standard capabilities was, for example, you can extract calendar information, you can extract emails, you can extract the whole keychain. You have access to the whole file system, you have access to the camera, you have access to the network, and you have, of course, access to the location on the device. And basically, you don't need to have every one of these single capabilities. I think file system access is even enough on a device. And yeah, basically, if you ever have been to a talk of Sarah Edwards or one of her trainings, you know what you can do if you have file system access on an iOS device and what you know about that person's life after that time. The second example, and this is quite funny because I was handing in my master's thesis in 2019 at the end of September. And Google just published that report in August. So I had basically everything on a practical side for my thesis already done. on a theoretical side, and then they published that report, and it's just matched perfectly to what I had done by myself. So yeah, on the one hand, of course, you have something which is then out there. You cannot like shine light on something new, but on the other hand, you have a practical validation for something that you did in theory, which was actually quite nice. So this malware was a campaign against a group of people. I think it's a group of Muslims inside of Nepal. And it had the basic standard capabilities as the Pegasus malware had also, except for monitoring the network traffic. I think in total it were like 14 CVEs which has been abused at that time on 5 different campaigns, and it went from iOS 10 to iOS 12. The detection has been basically made because Google found, or Google Tag found the infrastructure which was used for deploying that malware. And they were able to download the implant, they were able to download different exploit chains. Yeah, and the infection vector at that time was still WebKit, so it was also a one-click vulnerability. The attribution is kind of unknown at that time. Due to the target group, it might be that it's related to China, but I think no one can really tell. Yeah, and the technical analysis and detection, that's another typo here, this is also, of course, which has been done by Google Project Zero and Google Tag. Yeah, if you want to follow along the technical analysis, you can just go to the links on the slide. I will share the slides later on. Yeah. Then the third example, it's the second version of Pegasus, as I call it, because it's not using a one-click exploit anymore, it's using a zero-click, and it also doesn't use persistency anymore, at least as long as we know it. But honestly, if you have the possibility of just reinfecting a phone over and over again without the user being able to defend against it because it's a zero-click exploit, you basically, if the user is accessible, you can just exploit him. I don't think that persistency is really something that you want to go there as a developer of malware. Yeah. We only know of one really CVE which was related to that. That's the forced entry CVE, which was also analyzed by Ian Beer and Samuel Gross at Google Project Zero. We cannot say at the moment what are the capabilities of that malware, because the implant that has been used, they were never able to recover that implant. But what I can fairly say is that it's at least possible that all the other things that have been done on the first sample in 2019, which Google found, can also be done by Pegasus. So it's not really sure. Maybe they did something more, maybe they did something less. Without the implant, we cannot really tell. Yeah, Citizen Lab and Amnesty International found that one actually by looking at iOS backups and forensic artifacts. They found some discrepancy in different parts of databases. They knew about the infrastructure that NSO is using, so they also were possible to detect some calls to some websites. But this sample or this attack has also not being detected on the device itself by some kind of software, but it has been detected by forensic analysis later on. Yeah, infection vector was iMessage for that part, and at least Citizen Lab and Amnesty are telling us that this kind of version has also been coupled with different kind of vulnerabilities in iMessage, voice over Wi-Fi, iMessage again photo stream, and the IM transcoder agent from iOS 10 to iOS 14. No. The last sample, it's a report which also came out, I think, a couple of months ago. It's the Hermit malware. In comparison to the other samples, this one is it has an infection vector of a site-loaded application. So that's something that you as a company at least can basically, if you're using an MDM, you can completely protect yourself against. So it's kind of a rare sample. But this malware used a couple of open source exploits which have been used for jailbreaking, like Lightspeed, Sockport, time waste. And they also had 2 0 days. And I think Ian Beer will talk tomorrow about one of these more. So I don't want to spoil you the talk. Yeah, but there's also a nice blog entry on their website on how these exploits work. Still, we didn't recover any kind of malware implants, so we don't know what the capabilities of that malware are. Lookout found a similar sample on Android. So I also deducted that some of these capabilities might be the same, and I've added the same capabilities that I had for like the standard malware example that we had in the past. Yeah, the targets have been people in Kazakhstan and Italy, and the attribution goes to RCS labs. So if we compare now the first slide with all the CVEs, now with the ones that we have found in that public examples of malware that we know, we can see that we're missing a lot of stuff. So maybe there's more malware out there, maybe there's not, maybe there's just other CVEs that have been used by the same kind of malware, but we do not really know at that moment, so we also do not know how large that problem is of 0 or 1-click malware that can be running on iOS without further detection measures. Before we go into that, let's talk a little bit about malware and have first a recap of jailbreaks. So, as we've seen in that great talk of Linus, the process of app jailbreaking is at least you start with an exploit. Of course, you need to have some kind of infection vector. You then have typically a stage of elevation of privileges to make jailbreaking a lot easier for you. So you try to get rid of the sandbox. You try to get to be the root user. If you need some kind of entitlements or PPA bypass, etc. Then you're creating a shell environment, and after that, you're basically creating an app store and tweaks and Cydia. So there are two types of jailbreaks. The one is app jailbreaks, and this is also the one which relates more to malware, at least at the current state, which basically need an application to start the jailbreak. It's a it's semi-untethered, or it's an untethered one, which basically means sometimes it can be reboot safe if you have an untether, or you just need to restart the jailbreak after every reboot of the device. Some public examples are Uncover, Fugu 15, which hopefully will be released in a couple of days, and Chayote, which is at the current state not released. Then we have boot jailbreaks, like Checkrain, which are tethered, and the jailbreak is happening during the boot process. I make a distinction between both of them because the security mechanisms which are basically disabled are different if you have an app jailbreak or if you have a boot jailbreak, because if you are able to set the boot arguments of iOS, you can just disable a lot more security mechanisms than if you are just an application, because you don't have the ability to basically patch the kernel binary thanks to KTRR. So that means you cannot disable just mechanisms on the fly, which you can basically do if you're able to change the boot args. Then for me, there are three different parts of jailbreaks. There's a research jailbreak, which will just provide you a basic shell environment. For example, Mach Portal did, I think, in iOS 10, so from INBeer. Then you have a developer jailbreak, which allows you to further develop the jailbreak. Maybe you can start developing on tweaks, but this is still something which is a little bit risky. So if you do not know what you're doing on the operating system, you can still break your device, you can still get into troubles. And you have a user jailbreak, and this is what the final examples of Uncover, Chayote, and so on basically are. So they have a nice GUI, they are shiny, they have tweak support, they have comfort features, they allow you to restore the device, and these jailbreaks are basically made for the end user. But these are also the jailbreaks that typical jailbreak detection is looking at. So it's not looking at the more advanced jailbreaks, which may be more risky or maybe more similar to malware. It's basically looking at user jailbreaks. So if we compare that to malware on a technical level, we have some kind of comparisons. So malware always has also that infection vector. It has some exploits which it may be using for the infection vector. It has also a kind of elevation of privilege stage or post-exploitation depending on the need of the malware. And then it doesn't do, or at least the most often didn't do a lot of device changes on the device, and then it has some activity like a malicious app or implant or a command and control server. If you compare that to a jailbreak, the first three stages are basically the same. But afterwards, on the third stage, the jailbreak will change a lot on the device to make the user being able to install other applications, have a package manager, and so on and so forth. And that's basically where we have one of the differences. Because the jailbreak is doing something which has a change which is divide-wide seeable. And the malware actually doesn't want to do that, because the only interest of a malware is I want to be able to do a lot of nasty stuff on the device. I do not want to enable everyone else to do that, right? So that's the main difference. But if we're looking on a more organizational level, there are a lot more differences. So malware is typically attacker-oriented, while the jailbreak, of course, is user-oriented. Malware uses 0 days, while in most cases, our jailbreaks are using known exploits which have already been, of course, been fixed. Malware tries to be stealth because I don't want to be detected on the device. I still want to do my job, right? And the jailbreak just wants to be open, and the malware is focusing, of course, on extract data and control, while the jailbreak wants to liberate the device and applications. And that's why most malware, I would say, is at the moment on the device undetectable, and jailbreaks are detectable. Yeah, and of course, we only have a few known examples of actually iOS malware that we can analyze, and we have many known examples on jailbreaks. And of course, malware is targeted on single users or single user groups, and jailbreaks are for the mass market. So how are we detecting jailbreaks and malware like today? So typical detection mechanisms for a jailbreak is like you have files, you have folders on disk that you know of, for example, like /JB, or you know that the Cydia application is somewhere installed at a certain file path. You can detect that. You can detect changes on the device. For example, before iOS 15, you could detect that you have a remounted root partition. So the root partition of the device is normally just readable, but it's not writable. So if you remount it and you make it writable, you can just write to / something, and you can also detect, of course, if you try to write to that folder as an application. Then you had process or shared cache injections. At some time, you could also detect if something tries to just hook into some function and change something there. Of course, you have some disabled security mechanisms on the boot jailbreaks. If you see that maybe code signing is disabled, or maybe if the sandbox is at all disabled, you can detect such kind of behavior, because you can just execute stuff as an application which you are not supposed to, and which you normally get just killed by. And of course, there are some protocol handlers like Cydia, // which you can detect, but this is really just a user feature. But detecting is one thing, the reporting is a completely other thing, and this is where I think we are lacking most of the problems right now, because most jailbreak detections are just, they're detecting a single file on the file system and just saying, oh, I've got a jailbreak. So if you reboot the device, that file will still be there, but the jailbreak will not be active anymore, but your jailbreak detection still tells you, hey, I found a jailbreak there. Nice. So also, like, one event will trigger the complete detection of the jailbreak, but basically, if you have an ongoing jailbreak on that device, you will have multiple events that can lead to that conclusion. So maybe it's a good idea to just say, if I detected one event, that this might be some malicious behavior, and I flag it at malicious behavior, but it shouldn't be like flagged as a jailbreak. If you want to detect malware on the device, that's something that you at least cannot be doing today, but what you can do is you can, for example, examine crash logs on the device. So if you see that an exploit is not like 100% reliable, so it might be sometimes panicking the kernel, it might be sometimes relying that a process is crashed over and over and over again, but as the process is restarted, the exploit might be still successful, but you will get some of the crash logs. So if that malware is not deleting the crash logs, you might find some hints on unsuccessful exploitation attempts if you are analyzing the crash logs. But these crash logs are not accessible on the device. You have to extract them via macOS or some other kind of library on other operating systems, so you need to have some kind of other device to be able to work on that detection. Then, of course, you can do some network analysis. You can use local VPNs on the device. Maybe you see that there are some calls to some servers being made which are known for malicious behavior. Maybe you see that there's a lot of data which is transported from the device to somewhere else, and you can find some malicious patterns or some heuristics. But honestly, this is a lot of manual work, and I don't think that this is really something which is successful at the moment. Then, of course, you can do forensic analysis if you are being able to jailbreak the device to get a file system dump to do the forensic analysis, or you can work with an iTunes backup. And like I told you, Pegasus, the second version of that, and the MVT that Amnesty developed to find traces of Pegasus, it works exactly that way. But at most of the time, this is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Because first, you need to know that the device and the backup you're looking for has been really infected by a malicious software, so you need to know if that needle exists or not. So that's the first problem. And afterwards, if you know that there might be a needle because it has been infected, you still have to look at lots and lots and lots and lots of databases to maybe find some discrepancy or maybe find some artifacts. So that's a tedious task, and I'm really amazed of what Amnesty and what Citizen Lab did at that time to really find that, because I think that's a crazy, crazy amount of work. And then the last option that we have, of course, if you have access to your own zero-day kernel exploit or your own exploits on an older version of iOS, then of course you can use that exploit to elevate your own privileges, have a higher, just have higher rights on the device, and you can look at more and different examples to maybe find this kind of malware. And actually, maybe it's a good idea if you're belonging to a group which might be targeted by like zero-day, zero-click malware. Maybe it's a good idea to stay on an iOS device which is vulnerable, so you can try to detect it, because it doesn't make really a difference if you're on the latest version and you get hacked by the same zero-day, zero-click. And the risk of being hacked by n-day and click, I think it's not that high at the moment because most iOS users are updating, so the value of that kind of exploits and vulnerabilities is not that much. No. So what does that basically mean? That means that an attacker who has access to such kind of malware is basically able to extract information from the file system, is able to track the user, is able to extract accounts, passwords, to get access to camera and microphone without any chance of detecting that on the device itself. So no kind of mobile threat defense solution, no kind of EMM solution will basically help you to detect such kind of malware on the device at the current state. If that malware tries to do more manipulations on the device itself to maybe inject into other processes, or doing some other kinds there, tries to patch some apps, or tries to establish maybe a persistence mechanism, it might be possible to detecting it, but it's a cat and mouse game on that part. So, what can we do to improve the detection? For better detecting jailbreaks, it's basically quite easy because you don't want to detect jailbreaks. Actually, that's the thing that you're trying to detect is malicious behavior on a device. So you shouldn't flag a jailbreak as a detection there. You should try to flag every malicious behavior on the device, and you call it first that you found some artifacts, that you found maybe some instance of system tampering, and then you can still try to find out if you found 5 or 6 or whatever different artifacts, then you can map that to a jailbreak. You can also try to map some of these artifacts that you found on the device to known jailbreak samples which are on the market. And then, of course, you have to think if the user install, like, for example, Uncover or Checkdrain on the device, this is most likely not something malicious going on there. It's just the user which wants to do that. So maybe it's a better idea to just ask the user if he wants to do it or not, but I don't think that you will have some kind of malicious or malicious attacker ongoing if it's a valid jailbreak which is detected. So then you should differentiate between an active and an inactive jailbreak, because just think about the user just restarts its device, it updates the device, there might be some artifacts which are still on the operating system, it's detected as that. The user don't have the possibility to exploit its device anymore, and it's just because a single file has been there and it stays after an update of the operating system, your device is still flagged as jailbroken, so you can basically not use it anymore with such kind of behavior. So this is just crappy detection, and it's not really helpful at that time. Then, of course, you should differentiate between app jailbreaks and boot jailbreaks, because they're just doing different things on the device. And at least as someone on a company who tries to defend devices, you want to know, was it a boot jailbreak or was it an app jailbreak which the detection came from? Yeah, and of course you want to validate your findings on iOS versions, device types, and etc. So if you have a finding on the latest version of iOS, and it's just a file, I can tell you this has not been any kind of jailbreak, which is your problem. Maybe it's just a single artifact. But if you detect that there has been like a remount of the root partition on the latest version of iOS, this is definitely something you want to look into it. But if it just calls jailbreak, you're starting at basically nowhere. So you need to get more information, at least from a company who's trying to defend its devices. And as a user, I would like to have the same information as well. If you want to improve the malware detection, of course, something which is always good if you want to improve stuff, you could always improve the code quality and add more exploit mitigations. But it basically doesn't have to do anything with malware detection. But I think one of the first and necessary things that Apple could be doing is giving us something like that endpoint security entitlement that we have on macOS, also on iOS, and giving us like forensic capabilities of maybe accessing the file system, of maybe accessing also the RAM of that device. Maybe giving us on the device itself additional capabilities like looking into a process table at some parts of the device. I think Apple is really, really great at preventing exploits, at doing exploit mitigations and all that stuff, but I think they are lacking at the detection side of such kind of malwares on the device so far. So if I had to wish for something, I think at least to having access to the file system as a trusted application, or having access to some kind of endpoint security entitlement for more information as just for a trusted application, that would be really something that would be really great. Yeah. What companies can of course do, and they should do, is monitoring the network traffic, and they should, if they want to implement some kind of jailbreak or malicious behavior detection, they should do it by application. Because if you just have one application on the device which is responsible for your whole security and for the detection of everything, as an attacker, if you just know the 5 companies are doing endpoint protection, you can just basically shut down their processes, you can put them on hold, you can just avoid these kind of applications, and you can still doing your nasty stuff. So if you want to implement that your process, so you should take care of your own application, that your process is not going to be hijacked of some kind of malicious application outside. So together for companies and for iOS experts and defensive companies, you can do crash log and forensic analysis together, because this is something which is quite expensive. You need to have an intensive knowledge. This is not something that your standard company can do alone, but you can do it together with some kind of experts or defensive companies who have that knowledge available. What I also would love to see more is training on malware detections by maybe Amnesty, Citizen Lab, or Google Project Zero. So the guys who found that kind of malware, it would be really nice to have the advantage of looking into how they did that, to just train other people. The more people who are looking at these kind of things and have that capabilities, the better it is for us to really find also other players who might be still ongoing and we do not know about. The same applies for training on iOS exploitation, also on jailbreak development. If you look at the current state of that community, if you want to get into it, you have to learn a lot of stuff. And for new students, it's just not possible to buy a $5,000 training for iOS kernel exploitation. And also, if you look at training companies like Xans, for example, they don't really have an advanced course on ARM exploitation or even on mobile exploitation. So I think we have a lack there on training capabilities at these really needed skills, and more like on the advanced side. And of course, I would like also like forensic companies like Celebrite, Magnet, and all the other ones who are offering that kind of possibility. It's quite nice, but this is not tailored to do malware detection. It's more like to find out who did what at what time level, but you can use a lot of data there to find out which process might have been doing something on the device, which are typical process on the device. So if you have a lot of these backups from different devices, from different iOS versions, there might be something in there which can make it easier to do the detection. Some more research ideas is combining some EMM or MTD with crash log and forensic analysis. You need to have, of course, 2 clients because you cannot do that on the device. That's maybe another idea for Apple to give us access to crash logs, at least with an EMM system. But you can, of course, just have a macOS client or a Windows or Linux client extracting that data from that iOS device which is connected to it, and even if it's just once a month, and then use it for a combined analysis with your EMN and MTD system that you have on the other side. And of course, I think in iOS backups and file systems, there is lots of databases, there's lots of data there, and we just started to figure out what we can use outside of these databases to use for malware detection. So to sum it up, I think Apple's walled garden raises the bar for exploitation every year, and it really gets harder and harder and harder if we look at what Linus had to do to pop the latest iOS version, like combining 4 or 5 vulnerabilities. It's a lot of work, which is good for the consumers. It's bad if we want to analyze the system. Then we should take care of that we do not confuse malware with jailbreaks. We want to look at malware. We do not want to detect jailbreaks because jailbreaks are made for the user and malware is made for the attacker. The typical jailbreak detection at the moment is aimed at user jailbreaks. It's not possible to detect exploits and malware with an app on the device. We have to make improvements on several levels, and no one can fight this problem alone. So Apple won't solve this problem alone. We have to work on that as a community together if we want to get a stronger foothold here. So I like to finish with a side of Ian Beer, which he made when he was analyzing the malwares in 2019, and I think this sums up the current state of iOS malware detection on the device quite nicely. So, thank you very much. If you want to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn, you can just scan the QR codes. I also added a list of people on Twitter, which I think is the jailbreak community. So it's my combination of people who are working on iOS research or on jailbreaks. If you think you should be added to that group, you can also just direct me on Twitter. And I have a YouTube playlist of iOS talks that I come up with. If you're interested in it, you can just use it. Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm quite on time. If you have some questions.
So you mentioned it would be fairly simple for malware to detect if one of those security apps are running on the device,
yes.
The 5 companies you mentioned. Have you seen malware do that yet, or is it because those apps are maybe not that widespread? Do you think that's something we'll see? What are your thoughts on that?
I did not see it, but because I don't think that these applications are at the current moment able to detect this malware, so you can just stay stealthy in your way, you can do whatever you like. You do not have to even be stealthy on an exploit level. You just have to be stealthy on the kind of malicious activity that you're on the device. And I don't think that hooking into some kind of process is necessary anymore. You can basically just extract all the files from any major messenger application and you just get the raw data. So the SMS database, it's not encrypted. You get all the iMessage traffic there. Same applies for emails, WhatsApp, Telegram, I think Google Mail as well. So basically it's just free meal. Sorry? He asked if I reached out to Apple with regards to the endpoint security entitlement. Yeah, partly. I've tried to communicate with Apple a couple of times. It was not that easy. I try to use the contacts that I have at my company because we're working together. I've sent them over my whole thesis. I'm still waiting for some kind of response. So basically I'm just waiting for them to make contact to then, of course, come into some kind of discussions or talk. Sorry? No. Yes. I think the old version of Pegasus can be successfully detected because they're doing some stuff on the device like remounting. They're using some frameworks like Substrate to inject into some kind of applications. So that's all behavior where you're not staying to yourself, you're trying to change something on the device. This can be detected. I never tried out the old version of Pegasus to actually see if that works or not works. I've got into iOS research on iOS 11, so it was already 2 years old. No more questions?
Briefly, how do you think lockdown mode will impact either the attackers and or their malware? Is it just more of a exploit mitigation, or do you think even if they're successfully able to bypass it, it'll somehow get in the way of some of the malware?
I mean, lockdown mode is great for trying to defend against exploits like on iMessage, but basically it's also something that Ian said. If you just need to find some other kind of vulnerability which might be more powerful to bypass it, then exploit mitigations might not do the trick. So if I can start with like an exploit on WhatsApp, which has been done by NSO, then lockdown mode doesn't bring me anything advantage at all. Okay, then thank you very much.